this session was originally going to be the precursor to the next session, which was going to debate about Labour Party, but because of some changes in speakers, it was brought earlier in the week. So I missed that session, so I don't exactly know what was said in it, and I hope what I say doesn't repeat anything. But I think probably that would have been more about the future of the party, whereas what I'm going to talk about is the past. Actually, it's probably better to look at the past first before you look at the future, but that's the way the agenda works out. So what I want to start off with saying is that I've been now in the process of working quite a long time on a book series, which is a critical evaluation of the left from about 1850 to parts of the 20th century. The reason why I've been working on that is because, like many others, I've been through painful experiences of being active on the socialist left. And then finding that the group I was in my case it was the militant, which I talked about at the beginning of the book, finding that the problems in the organisation. And I left the militant after being involved for about 12 years, and my main field of work, although I was active in the Labour Party and others, but my main field of work was in unions. And I left in 1985 because, particularly during the miners' strike, and I'd set up a thing called the Broad Left Organising Committee, which had brought together 20 Broad Lefts from different unions. And then the militant was so sectarian in the miners' strike that despite the fact that we had a conference just at the outbreak of the miners' strike of 2,800 delegates, which was the biggest rank and file, certainly in modern history, the British trade union movement. And they were shop stewards and lorry drivers and even power workers and so on were there. And we had several hundred miners there, Scarlett was speaking. And we had the opportunity to use the format we had developed to help organise the picketing on the ground and bring the relevant workers together. But the militant were so sectarian that they used this thing purely to build their organisation. And that was one of the last straws, along with a few other things, that made me realise that the organisation, it had very good people in it, it had a lot of good policies, it had done a lot of good work, but inherently, almost in its DNA, like most of these groups, it was inherently undemocratic. The leadership were control freaks and inherently sectarian. So I came out of that and I said to myself, well, looking around the other groups, the same problems. Why is it that this keeps happening again and again? And I even went to the trouble of, when the militants split into two groups, I joined the wing that became Socialist Appeal. But within 2 years, I saw it was the same sort of thing being developed. And so I thought to myself, well, there's got to be a fundamental problem here. So that's why and when you do that sort of thing, you start to think, well, where does the roots of all these problems come from? And so that's what pushed me from the Middle Ages onwards to start looking at where the history of the Labour movement. Now, this became, I'm actually, next year, I'm coming out with my first book in the series, which is entitled Divide and Fall, and that looks at, from 1850 to 1900, mainly Britain, but a little comparison with Germany and France, the birth of the socialist movement. And this voyage of discovery that I got involved in, and what it did, it led me into discovering all sorts of things I thought had a pretty reasonable knowledge of the history of the left, and Britain particularly. But I discovered that I didn't really know much. And sadly, the books that have been produced about this, most of them, with the exception of one or two like Thompson and so on, they have been party political. Even the academics, there's been a few, you've got the right wing who give their reformist analysis, but when it comes to looking at Marx and Engels, because their practice is involved in all of what happened in this period, the First International and so on, they tend to either just be right-wing hatchet jobs, or they're Marxists who are defending everything that Marx and Engels said, and they don't say things that might be embarrassing, and they talk about all the other things in the most glowing light. And I approached it from a point of view of, well, I'm just going to have an open mind and approach it from using the tools of Marxism, but we can't, idolise everybody. And the first thing that struck me as strange was, and I'm giving the background to how the Labour Party started, because one of the mythologies that we have accepted and we have reproduced is that that the Labour Party started as a reformist organisation because the workers in Britain were reformist, They were affected by the fact that Britain was the main imperialist power. And so you get these phrases like, the Labour Party owes more to Methodism than Marxism. And these things are reproduced in Marxist pamphlets again and again and again. But I don't actually think they stand up when you study it. Now, my first question mark came when I saw the funeral of Karl Marx. And there were only 11 people at that funeral. I thought, this is very strange. And despite the fact that there were some telegrams coming from America and France and Germany and other places, from quite sizable organisations, but in Britain, nothing. And then I remember coming across an article or a pamphlet by Hal Draper, who was he was originally a Trotskyist. He kind of started to get more open-minded, and he's done a lot of good work on Lenin and Marx and so on. He's one of the persons who's gone into a lot of brought out a lot of stuff that nobody knew before. And he points out, and I thought, yeah, he's right, that the strange thing was that Marx and Engels never had a political centre. What by that he means a journal, a group around them, etc. And if you look at the way that Marx, for instance, operated in the First International, he basically ran the First International through just him and a couple of old cronies, Jung and Icarius, from the 1848 experience, the old German Revolution. And that's why Marx ended up in this dark situation. He's up at 2 o'clock in the morning, writing the minutiae letters, and he's doing every, ordinary stuff, which is dragging him away from a lot of important things he should be doing. And he complains about it because he's got nobody around him. And that actually had a lot of conclusion. That had a lot of consequences. So what was the strange thing was that all sorts of people started to hear about Marx's ideas in the First International, and started to declare themselves to be Marxists and believe they were Marxists, but didn't have a clue what this meant in practice. So you've got in America, for example, you've got 2 Marxist groups set up, one believing that you shouldn't stand in elections and use the parliamentary platform, the other believing you shouldn't involve yourself in the unions. And as a result, the Marxist movement in America was at its loggerheads. Neither of them had the right position. Similarly, if you look at in France, Marxist followers in France were highly sectarian. The same happened in Britain. Hinman, who set up the Social Democratic Federation, who believed himself to be permanently to be a Marxist for 20, 30 years, he was anti-trade union. And if you're anti-trade union, how are you going to build a mass movement? And so, unfortunately, because there was nothing where Marx and Engels were commenting on the day-to-day issues going on, they would occasionally, only a few times, but like Marx produced his pamphlet on the Commune, the Paris Commune. But most of the time, they didn't comment on the day-to-day things, just in private correspondence. So as a result, now another result of this was, I remember coming across this strange theory of the aristocracy of labour. And I remember, coming from my work in the trade unions, it didn't ring true to me. And when I looked into it, the more you look into that whole theory, it does not stand up at all. And that all the groups who are described as aristocrats of labour, when you actually look into those groups of workers, and even the unions, and even the union leaders, it doesn't stand up. I haven't got time to go into all of that. But why, and then I thought to myself, how could Marx and Engels be talking about this in Aristocracy of Labour, and when it doesn't stand up with all the strikes and the struggles that were going on? And there's this idea that somehow or other, that workers would be given, that Britain was doing very well economically in the 19th century, they were the workshop of the world, and that somehow or other that the wealth was being handed over to these workers. Well, I'm sorry, capitalism is not a charity. The only way workers could get a share of that wealth was by struggling. And the struggles they got involved in, which were happening almost every single year from the 1850s onwards, were the most bitter, vicious strikes, with the police far more vicious than we would know today. And class consciousness was strong among the rank and file, even in those unions like the engineers and so on. And one of the strange things was it was thought that this theory of the aristocracy of labour made it out that the skilled workers had been bought off by imperialism. They were a kind of crust over a seething mass of potentially revolutionary workers underneath. Completely incorrect. That actually the skilled workers turned out to be the best socialists and then the best communists later on. Well, there were many reasons for it, and that it was the workers down below who were the most susceptible to reformist ideas, and the most backward, and the ones who tended to go for jingoism and British imperialist ideology. And there are, of course, exceptions. You can point out the odd individuals, and there are famous examples of that. But overall, there was big potential in the British trade union movement and the British working class. And if you go into it, you start to see huge demonstrations coming out, 100,000, fighting the police. And the sad thing was there was nothing to organise. I mean, let me give you some examples of this. It was only 1884. 1884 was the first year where socialists actually went to a picket line, despite the fact that there had been strikes, all sorts of mass strikes from the 1850s onwards. And when they did go, it was actually Hinman turned up there with someone else. They were carried shoulder high by the cotton workers in Preston, I think it was. And actually they were able to establish an SDF, Social Democratic Federation branch there. It became very strong and almost won a fucking parliamentary election shortly afterwards. And similarly, it was something like 1893. It was the first time when a Trades Council socialist turned up to a strike and talked about socialism and got a massive response. And you can actually look at lots of other examples where the workers were ready for socialist ideas, but there was no organisation pushing for them. Now, one of the tragedies was that, I mean, something at which, and you discover things as you go along, that the first Labour Party was not the British Labour Party we know about, was actually set up in 1871-72. And it was set up because the First International, again I can't go into all details about this, had carried a resolution that they should, each country, they should try to set up socialist parties. And the British workers had, who could have actually set it up a bit earlier on, but hadn't been allowed to, but they decided that they set up a British section of the First International, and immediately they started organising a Labour Party. And within about 9 months, it had 45 branches around the country, and quite a lot of members, and its first conference adopted a Marxist programme, which included the nationalisation of all the means of production and so on and so on, and also what the CPDB talks about, quite a detailed programme for democratisation of British society, Republican and so on. Unfortunately, when the First International collapsed, which is a long story which I can't go into, but that destroyed this. It split it right down the middle, and it was still in its early stages, so that was a killer blow. Now, and some people might say, well, there wasn't really a basis for that, surely, in the 1870s. Well, actually, there was. I mean, the same basis that there was for building the German Social Democratic Party in the 1870s in Germany existed in Britain, even more so, because there were a much bigger proletariat in Britain. They had, in the Acts of Parliament in the late 1860s and early 1870s, had meant that in large numbers of the country, large areas of the country, the working class was the majority of the electorate. This they being able to vote. And although, again, it was mainly skilled workers, so what, and what actually happened was, originally, when this first came in 1867, a section of the trade union leaders secretly did a deal with the Liberals and worked on their behalf, and delivered a lot of votes for the Liberals, which is why the Liberals won the election. But then the Liberals turned around when they got into government, they completely betrayed them. So that there was, even the leaders of the trade unions who had actually, like Odger and some of these other characters who had supported the Liberals, decided that they needed a workers' party because they'd been betrayed and all the things they'd been hoping for. So that was why there was the background for a potential growth of the Labour Party, which is 15, yeah? 30. Okay. Then, unfortunately, again, because of this vacuum of politics that existed in terms of organisation in the left in Britain, this guy Hinman, who was a bourgeois from the city, he happened to be going on a steamer from I don't know if it was from France at that time or from Britain to America, and he had a copy in French of Das Kapital. And we have to remember as well that most of what Marx and Engels had written was not even translated until many years later. So the British workers couldn't even read their material. That's another consequence of not having a political organisation in Britain. And that, you might say that, well, Marx and Engels were German and so on, but they spent 40 years in Britain, from their youth they moved to Britain, and that was the rest of their life. And they did speak fluent English. First, Marx had some problems, but specialists who spoke fluent English and so on. So I don't understand why they didn't do it. And Hal Draper raises this question, and he doesn't understand it either. So then this Hinman guy, he's bowled over by Das Kapital and the ideas of Marxism and socialism and so on. So he starts this organisation called the Democratic Federation. And the trouble with this guy is that, although there's been a bit of a caricature of him, but nevertheless he had some negative characteristics, to say the least. One of which was that he was a bit dictatorial. And what the reaction to that, logically, was to fight for reform within that organisation and make it the organisation you want. Now that's what actually was starting to happen. Eleanor Marx and Edward Aveling and so on, all of this is another story, but they participated in the Social Democratic Federation, and at every step over this period of about 18 months, from 1883 to 1884, they had victory. They changed the party's name to the Social Democratic Federation. They brought in democracy into the organisation. Hinman's position was, as a kind of perpetual president, was removed. And just one thing after another, they had a victory. And then another very strange thing, which E.P. Thompson says is the weirdest thing it's ever come across, was that they walked out the SDF, having passed the majority. With a majority, they passed a censure motion on Hinman. To everyone's shock, they won the majority, and then they walked out, and they formed the Socialist League. Now, this was by this point, Marx had died, and Engels was in the driving seat on the sidelines, and he was helping to organise this split. So when they joined it, they set up the Socialist League. That was very quickly taken over by the anarchists. And then they realised later on that they'd made a mistake, that really there was no basis for this split in the Social Democratic Party, or Federation as it was. The tragedy of it was, it left this Social Democratic Federation controlled by a group who were totally confused about how to build the movement. And the fact that this organisation had huge numbers of people come through it, I can't remember the statistics, but it was like 100,000 at least people went through it. Most of the leaders who became the leaders of the Reformist Labour Party had been SDF members, including Ramsay MacDonald, Ernest Bevin, all sorts of people. And they started off as Marxists, they become alienated by the sectarianism of this organisation, and they left. That's why the Independent Labour Party had to be formed a little bit later on, to try and fill this gap. And there was an attempt by Blatchford, who had this Clarion paper, to show the potential support. He published a book about socialism called Merry England. It sold 1.5 million copies. It's in the 1890s. Now, he campaigned for the SDF and the ILP to join together. And among the rank and file, there was overwhelming support. They actually had a vote where 75% of both organisations wanted to join. But so alienated had become some of the leaders of the ILP from their experiences of being in the SDF that they kind of sabotaged it. So now we come to 1900, where the Labour Party is founded. So we've had all these, and I haven't been able to go into more detail, but we've had all sorts of opportunities to develop a Marxist socialist movement. It's the failure of that has then created this vacuum. That means that the workers have to get some political representation. So you get this strange formation formed of the Labour Party, which is a kind of conference of trade unionists, socialist societies, and so on. Now, in that organisation, they invite the Social Democratic Federation, which is an avowedly Marxist organisation. So it's in there at the heart of the Labour Party, its foundation. The ILP, which had a lot of Marxists in it, is also in at the heart of it. Plus you've got some trade unions, some of whom are left and some of whom are liberal-minded, but they want some representation for the workers. So what happens? In 2 years later, after the foundation, what does the Social Democratic Federation do? They put in an ultimatist, totally ultimatist way, they demand that the Labour Party adopts their full programme, and when they don't, they leave. And now this sets a pattern for how the left operates within the Labour Party for a long period. So what the first thing you'll see in this pattern is that whenever Labour gets into power, or has influence on power, following a successful general election, there'll be a period when, normally when the workers are quite loyal, they give them a chance, When Labour loses power and goes into opposition, then there's usually a big swing to the left. And this is a pattern that tends to establish itself across the left. But the first example of this is in 1908. So you'll see it just happens quite regularly. In 1908, the ILP, a big opposition developed within the ILP, because Labour was supporting the Liberals. It was a Lib-Lab pact. They were very disappointed, a lot of people. Victor Grayson, anybody heard of Victor Grayson? He stood in a parliamentary election, and so angry were working class people, they voted him in against the Labour Party. It's quite amazing. The left of the ILP wins the votes, and the leadership resigned, and they had a thing called the Green Manifesto. It was a socialist manifesto. What do? Instead of pressing home their advantage, they walked out of the ILP into and joined forces with the SDF and other people that formed the British Socialist Party, which we'll come to in a minute, to do with the history of the Communist Party. So then you see, then we go, if we come further forward to 1920. Now, I did listen to the discussion a little bit about this, how the CPGB was founded and so on, in relation with the Labour Party. But actually, when you analyse it, it's ridiculous. Here you have the British Socialist Party, which is affiliated to the Labour Party already. The British Socialist Party forms 80% of the new Communist Party, but by changing its name, it disaffiliates from the Labour Party. So, of course, for the right-wing leaders of the party, you go, oh, this is very nice and convenient. We've got rid of the communists. They've left. So then they apply to rejoin. Well, of course, it's much harder to kick people out of the club than refuse them to join it. And, of course, what the other thing was, that the negotiations, and I think they were in the Weekly Worker, where they reproduced the negotiations to form the British Communist Party. And actually you'll see the negotiations, a big part of it was the question of the Labour Party, with the BSP wanting to continue affiliation with the party, and Pankhurst and so on being against that. And at that point, because of the Communist International's insistence on having separate organisations called the Communist Party, in the end, that's how it ends up. So tragically, the Communists are separated from the Labour Party, which was a setback. And of course, from that point onwards, it became very difficult to read things. The next step is that we have the MacDonald government. And I'm sorry I'm having to rush through it because it's a very long period we're dealing with here, but I'll try and establish a pattern. So you get the 1924 Labour government. Although it's a minority government, which gives them lots of excuses, but nevertheless, there's a wave of disillusionment afterwards. People like, from the Popular Council, Lansbury, he starts to voice this. And as a result, the party starts to move towards the left, and this is accelerated by the general strike, so that for instance, Lansbury, who's on the left of the party, who had been sent to prison, if you remember, in Popular Council for defending the poor in Popular, he gets elected chairman of the Labour Party. In those days, they had an elected chair. So that's quite a significant development. At the same time, the Communist Party is doing some good work in the party, and they have developed the national left-wing movement, and they've got something like a quarter of the Labour Party constituencies behind them. At the same time, the ILP has elected, has humiliated MacDonald and Snowden, who have resigned because they stood for, they were the leaders of the party, and then the party decided not to nominate them as the treasurer of the Labour Party and other positions. So they resign, and who's elected? Maxton and Cook. So Jimmy Maxton and Cook are elected as the leaders of the ILP. I mean, Cook had been very close to the Communist Party. In fact, he actually joined it for a short time. He disagreed with certain things within strike action they had taken, but effectively he was a communist. And Maxton was very close to the Communist Party as well, from Glasgow, Red Clydeside. So this was a very favourable situation, but sadly, as we know, the Communist Party adopt this position of the third period, and what could have been a fantastic opportunity with a left-wing strand going inside the Labour Party, which has got some success, with the ILP going over towards the left, that could have been a fantastic opportunity. But sadly, for other reasons, the Communist Party withdrew from that. They closed down the national left-wing movement by a small majority. They walk out and into oblivion. And this is where the Trotskyist movement comes in, which is no better than the official communist movement. Some followers of Trotsky are in the ILP. and they're on a thing called the Revolutionary Policy Committee. And they start pushing for the ILP to leave the Labour Party. Well, what then happens is that the Labour government is elected in 1929, and almost immediately it's elected, it comes under this world crisis of the Great Depression. And contrary to what they thought they were going to do, they started bringing in cuts and all sorts of things. Well, this reached a certain key point in 1931 where they want to cut unemployment benefit, when unemployed become mass unemployment, and they want to cut the unemployment benefit. The trade unions say, no, we're not willing to accept this, and Labour is not willing to accept it. So Ramsay MacDonald and Snowden and Thomas, they go over to form the national government with the Tories and the Liberals, which is a complete betrayal. But you can imagine the effect this has on the Labour Party. So the Labour Party becomes incredibly radicalised. This is the period when they start adopting all sorts of policies, stretches, policies and so on, and saying that we must have an enabling act so that when the next Labour government comes in, we take over the means of production, we bring in socialism. This is the kind of mood that was developing inside, because you had a mass economic crisis in the world. You had the example of the Soviet Union, which seemed to be going forward very fast, had a big influence. Plus you just had your leadership, your right-wing leadership, who were arguing for being moderate, betrayed you. So you can imagine how radicalised in that situation it became. But that was precisely the time when the ILP broke away, partly under the influence of the Trotskyists. And the ILP went from being an organisation with 149 MPs, about 100,000 members, they went down to about 5,000 members within 4 years. And why did that happen? Well, one of the major reasons was the electoral system in Britain. And even Trotsky, who had fully supported the split of the ILP, he then, within 2 years, he changes around and starts to backtrack when he starts to realise, because he didn't probably know, the British electoral system is a mince grinder for these kind of other parties. So what he starts to realise is that the way the workers see it, and it comes to the London elections in 1934, he sees the fact that if the ILP stand against the Labour Party, which is what they wanted to do, they would just let Tories in. And that's how the workers saw it. And because there is, you don't have proper PR in Britain, it is this kind of thing where you've got to make these choices. And so he recommends that the ILP doesn't stand against things. So you can see even Trotsky from abroad is starting to see these things. And so the ILP was on a hiding to nothing, to be honest. The CP was working with them, hoping to win people from them. But anyway, so, and then if I come forward to the, I've got to kind of jump forward in time. Having said this pattern about when Labour goes into opposition, it goes to the left, we saw the same process in the 1950s, after the 1945 50-51 government. We saw Bevanism and a lot of opposition developed within the party. We saw the same thing after Harold Wilson's government. When Harold Wilson fell from power, the Labour Party very quickly moved to the left in the 1970s. And we saw again the same pattern in 1979, after Labour lost. Again, a long period when Ben nearly became leader of the party and all that sort of thing. So you can see this. So actually, the pattern that we've seen in the history of the party is being repeated right now. I was writing a couple of years ago about what would happen when Labour lost, and it was obvious, because if you study this history, you know it's almost like a cycle, that there would be a radicalisation of the party. It depends on many factors, but if, for instance, if we look at what's been happening, massive increase in party membership, election of a centrist figures against the hard right Blairites, but still, if you actually saw anyone who was here, I don't know any party members here. If you read the election addresses, that was an interesting development, by the way. Social media, people don't realise. The reason why Miliband won that election was social media. People don't realise that. The fact was, for the first time, instead of just getting it through the party headquarters or just through the newspapers, we actually received as party members 5 election addresses from each of the candidates over a period of months. So we're actually able to read those, and in that, Miliband says we've got to put beyond Blairism, we've got to get back with the rank and file of the party, we've got to be radical, and so on. So, thanks. And now we see within the trade unions, which is natural, because there's none of that excuse with Labour in office. The trade unions get more radicalised, there's battles breaking out within the Labour Party over those questions. There's all sorts of possibilities there for the left. Now, this is where I'm going to talk about entrism. which was the kind of, well, Trotskyists weren't the only people to practice entrism. The Communist Party was practicing entrism at different times, but it was a deep entrism where they would not have a paper, they didn't have a Labour Party paper, and they didn't declare they were seeking members, etc. The militant was a bit more obvious, although again, it involved this key thing about secrecy. And when you see the way that the Trotskyists operated, first they operated on the tactic of short-term entrism in the 1930s and 40s, and it was pretty disastrous. I've written a whole analysis, detail about all the twists and turns of it. It led to the Trotskyists being less influential at the end of the 30s than when they started off, actually. They broke up into 3 or 4 different groups in Britain because they kept switching. First they went to the ILP, and the idea was that everybody must do it. This kind of sectarian attitude, which is that everybody must follow one line, and even as a tactical position. So they split when they decided to go into the ILP. Then they discovered that the group who didn't want to go into the ILP said there was more action in the Labour Party. That turned out to be the case. So then Trotsky changed his mind, and that group in the ILP splits. Because, C.L.R. James, anybody heard of him? He was recruited in the ILP, but if you recruit somebody in a party, they naturally don't want to leave the party. They've got all their mates there, they believe in the future, they want to reform it, they want to improve it, build it. But the Trotskyist idea of entrism doesn't take any of these things really into account. So they just left the ILP, went back into the Labour Party, split again, and it just got on. And so you end up with about 4 different groups, all fighting each other like cats and dogs. And then after the Second World War, or at the end of one of the strangest things, again for short-term opportunistic advantage, in 1941, the main Trotskyist group, which was the Ted Grant was a leading figure in, left the Labour Party on the eve of its greatest radical period and its success. And probably, I've done some calculations. I reckon that the Trotskyists probably could have got 20 or 30 MPs in that parliament, because it was just so open. It was such a rather strange situation. Anyway, they stayed outside the Labour Party, and it destroyed them. They had these huge battles under the Labour government. They couldn't figure out what was going on, why the workers were supporting this, and all their predictions of immediate revolution didn't work out. So then what strange thing happened in the 1950s, and this is where we start to get up to date. In the 1950s, Ted Grant, having been the leading opponent in the 40s against being in the Labour Party, decides, well, we're all broken up and there's hardly any Trotskyists left. There's nothing else to do. I might as well be in my local Labour Party. And this is a period, by the way, when he had to share a caravan in Dalston with Tony Cliff. Even though they were in separate organisations. Anyway, so pretty bad days, and so in the difficult days of the 50s. Now the trouble was that the militant got involved in the Labour Party. They weren't called militant then, I can't remember what they were called now.
Revolution Socialist League?
No, that's a slightly bit later. They had different names before that. But anyway, so they didn't have any strategy of what they were going to do in the Labour Party. So they kind of, in the Labour Party, don't know what to do. And actually, a very sectarian attitude. So the developments that take place in terms of the Bevanite movement, they don't really participate in that. Every other left-winger is a reformist, a centrist, sellout, or whatever it is. And so, and you'll see this pattern repeating itself. There have been various opportunities to build a broad left in the party, which is absolutely essential. And they either don't participate, or even when we get into the 70s, they actually start to try to sabotage it. So, for instance, an example was the Socialist Charter. You heard of the Chartist group? This is what they came out of. The Socialist Charter in the... unfortunately, Chris is not here, is he?
No.
Ah, yeah.
It's 4 doors down the road.
Okay. Well, if he came in, it would be very interesting to hear he justified, because his fellow communists slayed him terribly. What he actually did, they formed... At the end of the 60s, the Tribunites, the better Tribunites, decided they needed a national organisation. And so, to fight what was happening with the betrayals of not betrayals, but, sellouts of Wilson. So they set up this thing called the Socialist Charter, which was not a bad programme. The idea was to popularise the thing and get it organised and run the farm, not just the Tribune in Parliament, but all over the country. So what happens is... a group of headbangers joined this group, who, including Graham Bash, who's now admits that it was terrible, Keith Van Ness, and other people. And they discover that there's a meeting in London where about 50 people, and they discover that they've got about 23 or 24. They do a head count. They realise they've got 23 or 24 people in the room. So Chris gets up and says, right, everybody, so we've done a quick calculation. We're obviously in the majority. We're going to turn this organisation into a revolutionary socialist body. And basically the rest of the Tribunates and other people who don't want to go along with that and pay big subs and all the rest, he puts it like this, leave the room. he does this off his own bat. He didn't even consult with his comrades. And then afterwards, Keith Vaness was telling me, and I talked about this with Graham, he said afterwards, they said, have we done the right thing? Might it not have been better to, with the Tribunates, because they get cited, but then afterwards they've got this suddenly their small group, and they've got this mountain to climb. Well, might it have been easier if we'd have had the names of the MPs and we could have built a big movement, we could have recruited them. Anyway, so then comes 1975. Dennis Healey is gone to the IMF and used that as an excuse to dump the manifesto of the 1974 Labour government. And this caused a big reaction among the rank and file, the activists and the left activists and so on, and the trade union movement. And the Tribunates issued a very good letter to all the constituencies protesting this and showing exactly how it was all wrong and a protest against this. And they got huge amounts of support in the constituencies and trade unions. And actually it got groups from around the country writing into them saying, could we possibly form tribune groups locally? And this doesn't, it might seem a small thing, but it was not. We were in a rather strange situation in the Labour Party by that point, and I was very active in it, where the left was overwhelmingly powerful. We had the NEC, we had a lot of the trade unions behind us, we had a lot of constituencies, but we weren't organised. So all sorts of stupid things happened. If you don't get yourself organised and challenge the right wing, you can't even get anywhere. Well, there was a situation where if you had a united left in large parts of the country, we could have won most of the reselections, or selections they were in those days, sorry. And not only that, we could have also retired a lot of those witch hunters in Labour Party headquarters who were carrying on from the old days. And what was the militants' reaction to this thing? They went to a meeting with the Tribunates in Parliament. They had a meeting. And Ray Apps, any of you might have heard of Ray Apps, he was a leading sort of militant Labour Party activist and stood for the NEC a lot and so on. He came back and told me that basically they'd said to the Tribunates, look, fuck off. The constituencies is our area, Parliament's your area. You come here and we'll either break them up or we'll take them over. So people like Ian Mercado and the more right wing of the Tribune group, that was all they needed, because they didn't want any run for Parliament movement, because that would have been accountability. They liked to be in their ivory tower of Parliament so they could do their own thing, pursue their politics a bit like Harvey, I suppose. Anyway, so that was a tragic thing. So 4 years went by that eventually the left did get organised in the rank and file mobilising committee, but that 4 years was absolutely crucial. If we had got organised the left in 75, I'm certain that Ben would have been the leader of the party, and many other things would have come in faster, like reselection and so on. And yes, there would have been a split, but would have been much better, more favourable terms. And we'd have actually had, for the first time, we'd have had a relatively left-wing manifesto. It wasn't a full socialist programme, we know that. But you'd have had a relatively left-wing manifesto with a leader arguing the case. The Labour Party in the early 80s got into the worst of all worlds with a relatively left-wing manifesto and a leadership who were not willing to argue and defend it. We couldn't get a worse situation. So that was one of the reasons. Plus, of course, you had the Falklands War, where Ben took a much better position, which was more popular with the public, but because he wasn't the leader and so on. Then the miners' strike. So the pattern I'm trying to get across here is that there tends to be developments to the left after Labour loses power, and it's then how does the left react to that? And too many times, like they did with the SWP or the IS as they were called, the ING, they all left Labour in the 60s, so they were not in the position to take advantage of the leftward development in the 70s. And the same has happened this time. All the arguments I hear from SWP, Socialist Party and so on about the Labour Party, it's a bourgeois party, blah. I heard them all before. I heard them at the end of the 60s and the early 70s, word for word. And the thing is that their analysis of the Labour Party is very undialectical, because the Labour Party is a contradictory mechanism. And actually, you could say that the class struggle goes right down the middle of the Labour Party. And not just the Labour Party, the trade union movement, every community organisation in Britain, because it's a battle between bourgeois society and reformism and, ending capitalism. And that argument goes right down through the middle of it. And in fact, you could argue that it's a compliment to the strength of the workers today, that the ruling class has to take so much effort to try to keep the Labour Party under its control. You imagine if the Labour Party was to become left-wing, what a destabilising effect that would have within Britain. And we see it's not the answer. I mean, it's part of the process. But we see in other countries where, like Chile and we see in Venezuela and so on, that when you've got a left's reformist leadership, that starts to open up a whole revolutionary development, which then it's up to us to take through to its fulfilment. So, the history of the Labour Party, to sum up, I don't think that the Labour Party needed to have been reformist from the beginning. I think we on the left have been cursed with sectarianism in Britain, and it was well before the Labour Party. And the way the left has reacted to developments in the Labour Party has thrown away too many good opportunities. Now, the question is, what will the future be? And this is where you obviously had a discussion the other day, and you will have a discussion now. I personally think that because of the electoral system, I mean, in Scotland, I joined the Socialist, I'm a member of the Labour Party and the Scottish Socialist Party, because in Scotland you do have an element of PR, so there is a space for a left party, a broad left party, and the way the Labour Party's gone and the media have gone, they've squeezed out our voice altogether. They're afraid. It's not because they feel strong, it's because they're afraid. They don't have left-wing analysis about the crisis at the moment, the banking and so on the television, because they know that a lot of people will sit there and go, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. They don't want that. They're frightened of that. So obviously in countries like where you have PR like Germany and Sweden and other countries like that, you have broad left parties. Fair enough, because they're giving a voice to that suppressed voice. And similarly in Scotland, similarly in Ireland. But in England and Wales, unfortunately, the electoral system means that you can't get that voice outside the Labour Party. So I think it leaves us in a position where we should start to think about how to do it. Now, I'd finish on this point. The problem with entrism, and this might be of some relevance to your future thoughts, whether it's practiced as a short-term tactic or a long-term tactic, entrism in itself can never succeed. Why I say that? That doesn't mean we shouldn't be active in the party, in the Labour Party, unions, whatever. But as an interest, the tactic of secretly going in and working as a secret body, in the end, does not work. Why? First of all, if you're a small group, then nobody takes any interest in you. As you start to get any influence, you start to challenge the right wing in one particular area or nationally, whatever, then the spotlight comes on you. And your attempt to be secret doesn't work. I mean, the militants showed that. And that, remember, was in a period when we didn't have the online WikiLeaks and all that sort of thing. Nowadays, you just have to have one member who's fed up. Never mind MI5 infiltration, but you just have to have one member fed up. Suddenly decide, oh, bugger it, and they just publish all the documents online. And how are you going to deny it? Because people will be able to read it, they'll be able to see reports about this at work and arguments, and yeah, he does make those arguments word for word. And you're not going to be able to deny it. So secrecy is not going to be maintainable in the future for this tactic. So that's a very important point. Now, if you're not secret, then if you're open about it, well, the problem you've got then is if you the interest tactic, part of the interest tactic is this idea of we're going to join some aspects of the labour movement with the idea of leaving it at a later date to form our pure revolutionary party. And we're going to take all the best elements. Well, of course, any organisation you join on that basis is going to see you as an enemy. They're going to see you as a party within the party, coming in, feasting off like parasites, the best people, trying to make them look bad, and then leave. Well, obviously, they're not going to tolerate that. We wouldn't tolerate it inside our groups, I'm sure, or any movements we're in. So of course, the right-wing labour movement wants to get rid of us as well. So this just gives them a golden opportunity to use this argument about secrecy, Euro conspiracy against the membership. And the membership go for it, of course. So then we have to think about the conclusions. If this is not going to be possible, how else are we going to work? And I think a lot of interesting questions come up about that. And I don't think it's insoluble. I don't have a negative attitude towards it. I think it's entirely soluble, but I think it needs us to approach the work in a different way, and with a longer term perspective and a more open and transparent way. And we're then going to have to think about how we pose questions. I mean, an example being, if you go into the Labour movement, and a lot of people, they try to make this argument about reformism just the Labour Party, but it isn't that, because the people who've left the Labour Party, like the Socialist Party, they find the Labour Party people, or social democracy, or reformist thinking, everywhere else. So they go into a tenants' organisation, and then the argument is there. Do you kick up against the council who's giving you some grunt, or you go into community organisation, you go into trade unions, or the trade union leaders are social democrats, and so on. You can't escape this argument about reformism and how to deal with it. One of the trouble is, though, if you have this denunciatory attitude, which is what a lot of left-wing people get into, make themselves feel better. They get in there and say, "Ah, you traitor," you know, agent of the ruling class, and all this stuff. Of course, if you come into an organisation, whether it's a trade union or whatever, the members have got illusions in their leaders. They think their leaders, okay, they may not be as radical as I like them to be, but they're working in a very difficult situation. They're making the best job they can. And if you come in that way, you just alienate people. They don't listen to you. So we have to think, how do we approach this better? How do we organise better if we're going to be part of the Labour movement? Thanks. On the question, for instance, about the history of the CPGB, the founding of CPGB, which I think is probably very interesting to you. I think that you're taking it out of the context of what was happening. You have to bear in mind that the Comintern had an international drive to break all the revolutionary elements away from social democracy and form them into separate communist parties who are not affiliated to social democracy. And if you read the material that's being put out by the Communist International at that time, and from the end of 1917 onwards until probably around 1921, it's blood-curdling stuff against the Social Democrats. It's calling them renegades, agents of the bourgeoisie, turncoats, yellow, every anti-extreme things that you would now, if you read them, you would go, wow, shit, that's ridiculous. Can't say that unless you want to alienate all the workers. And I've got all sorts of collections of that stuff, coming out from the Comintern. So, and that was the reason, by the way, the United Front was totally unpopular. The United Front tactic that was adopted in 22 was very unpopular among the Communist Party rank and file, because they had been brought up on the basis of this: the Social Democrats are the devil with horns. How could we possibly work with them? But the reason why the United Front came was because the Communist Party internationally, Communist movement, realised that they had started out with a perspective, which was that Lenin had this idea, which was that we'll plant our banner and all the workers will come to us. They've been totally demoralised and disillusioned. They've seen that the Social Democracy betrayed them in the First World War. It was a completely wrong analysis, because actually the vast majority of workers did not blame the Social Democrats for the First World War. They blamed the people who took them into the war, which were the old regimes, the Junkers, monarchists, and so on. And we have to remember that the Socialist International had, the Second International, had opposed right up until before the war started. They had opposed vigorously, even with mass demonstrations, again and again, we mustn't have a war, it'll be disastrous. The war starts, there's a huge feeling of patriotism among the middle class, which affects sections of the workers. There's no other show in town, so that when they see some Social Democrat ministers in junior positions participating in these governments, they think it's part of the war effort which they support. And we have to remember that. So when they at the end of the war, far from social democracy being finished, it goes from strength to strength. If you judge it in terms of trade union membership, in rise of social democratic votes and so on, there's an explosion of social democracy after the First World War. And this ran completely counter to what the Comintern expected. So as a result, by 1922, they realised that they have not won the majority of the workers, and therefore they've got to come back and try and find tactics to to reach the social democratic workers, and the United Front was all a part of that. So then, if you put it in that context, the CPGB negotiations to form the CPGB, you've got the British Socialist Party who's affiliated to the Labour Party, who understands the purpose of that. You've got maybe 20%, Pankhurst and Gallagher and these people, who are actually ultra-left at that point, in my view, who are demanding, and they actually make it a condition of the founding of the Communist Party that it disaffiliates from the party, effectively. They are absolutely adamant about it, and you printed it in the Weekly Worker, that the BSP leaders very reluctantly go along with that, because they're under this natural feeling that they want to all join all the revolutionary forces behind the Russian Revolution and so on. Not a little factor in this is the question of money as well, which the whole scandal, the whole thing about John Maclean comes into as well. That John Maclean was very suspicious of the Communist Party being founded. He thought, where's all this money coming from? And what was actually happening was the Comintern was providing large amounts of money to its representatives to go into different countries. And that is not a healthy situation, because you come with all and often they were second-rate people, some of them, who were coming. They were coming with all the glory of the Comintern behind them, with lots of money. And they were able to influence developments. And a lot of these agents who came didn't really know the labour movements very well that they came into. So Maclean complained about this. He went down to London he went to the founding conference, and he said, where's all this money coming from? And because he was such a big figure, Lenin's Colsall in Scotland and so on, they had to take him upstairs and show him the books. And he looks in the books and he sees that the vast majority of the money's come from Moscow. So he said, this is not healthy, this is not correct. So he didn't join the Communist Party, and then all sorts of internecine things happened. And in fact, well, that's another story. But the point is that split that happened, that the breaking away from the Labour Party, was not an accidental thing. It was part of a general international position of the Comintern. And unfortunately, the BSP were the mainstay of the Communist Party, went along with that because they felt that was the only way they could form this communist movement. So now, whether or not, if they'd have stayed in the Labour Party, they would have been thrown out. There would have been pressures to throw them out, we know that. And it's said about, well, these tactical manoeuvres and small differences and clever this and that don't make any difference. I'm sorry, when you're active in the internal struggles of the Labour movement, these things make a difference. Sometimes things can turn just on even one person in a key meeting can make a difference. I've seen it again and again and again. And it all depends on developments that take place. So it's not just about what the Communist Party, whether it was affiliated or not, but it's what it did with it. Even if it was affiliated, how did it operate? How did it approach the party membership? Now, somebody asked me about, how does this thing about the left going to, the parties going to the left in opposition? I mean, this question is actually an interesting one, because I had to say that the left, the revolutionary left, does not really understand social democracy. And they've never really properly studied how the consciousness of social democratic workers and so on work. That's why they don't really understand reformism a lot of the time. I mean, they think that, you could leave the Labour Party and it'd be fine. But, I mean, the swing, I've got to agree here with Owen yesterday, the swing to the right of the Labour Party in the last 30 years has been unprecedented. But so is the swing to the right of society. And social democracy is a weather vane. It's actually an opportunist thing that just moves around with the moods of the societies. And when I say there's a thing down the middle of it, which is the class struggle, that's in the trade union movement and everywhere else. And we've seen a swing to the right and a dampening down of socialist consciousness for all sorts of reasons for the Soviet Union. I haven't got time to go into them. One interesting reason why the Labour Party has gone to the right, which is in which I'll answer the question about which Lee asked about. Hasn't it been the pattern where the left has got weaker and weaker each time in opposition? No, I don't think there is any pattern in that. The Bevernites were not very particularly left-wing, by the way. They weren't strong, they weren't well organised. The Bennite movement, if I give it that name, but it wasn't the Bennite movement, but the left movement in the Labour Party shook the Labour Party to fucking core. And the ruling class was frightened about it. Because they saw the Labour, that's why the right-wing Social Democrats left. They, in the beginning of the 80s, when they left, they thought they had lost. They thought the left had got the Labour Party, that's why they left it. A few people like Hattersley and Healy said, no, we shouldn't leave, we've still got a chance. But they were in a small minority. They thought they'd lost the fight. And if a Labour Party becomes left-wing, They are worried about that possibility because they pretend that left-wing ideas are not popular, but they can be popular if they're put forward in the right way. And if you've got a mass party, and the Labour Party is a pillar of the establishment, you know, the system here, if that pillar starts to go to the left, it destabilises the whole system. And that's why they were so frightened. So one of the main reasons why the Labour Party became so undemocratic, you know, so centralised, was because they had such a fright with the move towards deselection of MPs, election of leader, the move which would have come to decide the manifesto in the rank and file and so on, that they got such a fright about that, they decided, well, we're not going to allow this to happen again, and they closed all these rules down and tightened them all up. So we've got far more right-wing Labour Party than we ever had before. But interesting, significant little things that it's only if you're active in the Labour Party you know what's going on, because if you're outside, you see the way the bourgeois media presents it a lot of the time. Even the left media, when they do report it, because they're outside the Labour Party, they just report the negative side of it, but they don't report all what's going on. For instance, at a large party conference, because the trade unions have gone now away from control of the Blairites generally, they voted for, and it was carried, that the conference will now have resolutions again. It's not a little thing, it's quite an important thing. Another thing is that we're now in the position where it's possible that the left will take the Conference Arrangements Committee, which was our power base in the 70s that allowed us to use the conference to express socialist ideas. Another example, against furious opposition by the Blairites, it was carried that the National Policy Forum, which is a bit of a toothless body, is actually now the constituency representatives are going to be elected, and they started elections in which the left got 20 seats on the National Policy Forum. And even in the individual elections among party members for the NEC, the left is winning the majority of those votes. So on an individual ballot, which is quite amazing. And that's in a period which we're still before the big cut struggles come, what I think are possibly going to be big pay strikes come, and all the other things. So, you know, now let me just answer a couple of other quick points, otherwise I don't want to not leave time for a discussion. Another thing about Ben, by the way, I'm sure if Ben had become the leader, he would have backpedaled on some of these things and so on. But you have to bear in mind that Ben was undergoing constant death threats in this whole period. And he had got to the point where, you know, he became, and even, it's funny, even in 1984 in his memoirs says how about he accepted the Marxist theory of the state because of what he saw in the miners' strike. He was a very open kind of character, and it was an unusual character. He was not going through the normal trajectory of going from the left to the right. He had been on the right, you could say, and going to the left. It's a bit unusual. But he'd gone through ministerial office. He wasn't interested to that extent. He'd had all the fruits of power, and you've seen how useless it was. Anybody who reads his diaries will see his personal experience. So sometimes we can... what was key about the developments in the 70s and 80s was that it was organised left. And if Ben had been elected, it would have been because we had put him in there. Not just because he'd got in there by some... And the tragedy was that we weren't organised enough, and this is where the broad left tactic is important. Of course we need socialist programme within the broad left and so on, but if you don't have a broad left, as we know in trade union work, as we know, and we should know in Labour Party work, you're not going to get anywhere. The tragedy of the LRC is it's not doing this work. That's the tragedy. And when you talk to LRC members, they've hardly got any base on the ground at all. They're not concentrating, they're not focusing, they're kind of half in the Labour Party, half outside the Labour Party, not really sure what they're doing. And I have put forward the idea of organising a Labour left conference, which was carried by our conference, the LRC conference in January, but still not much being done on that. I agree that we need to... this is where I would disagree with the comrade from International Bolshevik Organisation, is it? Tendency, so whatever. I don't agree with you. I think when you go into see what the disaster that tactic of entrism brings you, and the sectarianism creates inside your own group, I think it's a mistake. I agree with I think it was Jack said about, or someone said about a strategic approach to Labour. I think we have to have that. An example is that you basically have this attitude where you're going to go into the Labour Party, and this thing about it's the timing that's important. Well, I'm sorry, it doesn't work like that. You know, Labour Party is not an orchard that you can just climb over the wall and pick the apples when you feel like it. You know, if you want to get support among workers, you have to do the graft beforehand, so that when the swing comes, you're in a position where they're going to look to you and listen to you because you've built up credibility in the position. You can't suddenly wait until you see the movement come and then join in. It doesn't work. You don't get the support. People are already, what's actually happened is a leadership has been formed who are leading that struggle, and that's what they listen to, not you. And yeah, you could win a few people, but tends to be that you, and don't you think that the party members think, what a sectarian bunch of parasites who come in and try and get us in the good times, you know? What kind of attitude is this towards the labour movement? It encourages a very sectarian, parasitic attitude among the left to do that. And it doesn't work. The irony is that it's only long-term entrism in the British Labour Party that's actually did anything. If you look at short-term entrism, it never achieved anything in the British Labour Party. Long-term entrism did achieve some things. So, for instance, in the militant, all the criticism I would make of them, they got members of Parliament, they got control of some councils, they had a big... No, it's not a joke. They had a situation where for 6 years, almost every day, the question of the left in the Labour Party and militant and so on was on the front page of the newspaper. And they recruited thousands of Labour Party members all over the country. They took over the youth movement. They took over half the student movement. And these were serious achievements, and probably from an interest perspective, the best achievements internationally of the Trotskyists. But unfortunately, inbuilt into it was still this perspective that we're going to go off and form this perfect, pure revolutionary organisation. And we're going to be secretly organising for that day, which meant they were vulnerable. And sorry. This question was raised about setting up a like a revolutionary party. The problem we've got is that the only example we've had of a democratic workers' revolution really is the Soviet one, the Russian one. And the unfortunate fact within that was not made by a separate revolutionary communist party. That was made by the Russian Social Democratic Labour Party, which was the mainstream of the social democracy in the country. And Lenin had succeeded in, for a whole number of reasons, winning a revolutionary leadership for it. So if one was to take the only successful model we're used to, then one would have to say, well, that's interesting. In fact, it's so unforgotten is this, that when I've talked about this on forums, I've had a lot of revolutions come out. Is that true? So, because they've got this idea in their mind. Now, what actually happened was, after the Russian Revolution, Lenin, by the way, in April 1917, at the famous April Theses Conference, he put forward this, he put forward this program which you've written about, which I like your analysis, the CPGB's analysis about it, which was in tune with the history of the party, and the rank and file supported it, which was to, bring down the provisional government for all powers of Soviets and so on. What's not generally publicised is that Lenin at that conference said that the Bolshevik Party, the Russian Social Democratic Labour Party majority, that's what their name was, should change its name then to the Communist Party. And how many people do you think voted for that? He argued very strenuously for it. How many people voted for that in this conference?
20.
One person, Lenin himself, and the rest of the Bolsheviks thought he was crazy. He said, how could we change in midstream our party name? And we built up a tradition among the workers from the end of the 19th century, and they're loyal to our party, they respect our party, they're following our party. You want to change the name, it's going to cause all sorts of confusion. What's going to happen? And these questions came up, as an overview proposed and so on, said a small rump could take, or people enemies of the party would take the name RSDLP, and the workers would be confused. And ironically, when they did change the name the following year, when they were in power, it did cause mass confusion among the population of Russia, to the point where you have peasants' diaries where they say, oh, those Bolsheviks are fantastic, they gave us the land. Those communists, I hate them, because the communists are coming to take the grain for the Civil War, And so so it was only after, ironically, it was only after the Russian Revolution this whole idea of a communist separate movement, pure revolutionary movement, came about. And the trouble is that we've had 90 odd more years of it, and it hasn't worked. And I think, if we're scientific socialists, we have to say to ourselves, well, why? And now your conclusion could be many different things, but one of my conclusions is that it doesn't link to the way the workers think, especially when they form their own parties already. And how you relate to that is very complicated. So this idea that you can just say, oh, we need to set up the revolutionary party, and that somehow or other will be achieved, and just we can ignore the Labour Party or just attack them and that'll do it. I'm afraid it doesn't work, and the history has not shown that to be the case. Now you could almost, I don't want to caricature it, but you could say, well, the working class is reformist. Let's leave them. I mean, we haven't convinced the working class. They're not making the revolution. You could slag them off. Some people do. Let's leave them. And some people even do that. They're going to go off into other fields and say, oh, the revolution's got no chance. So the fact that that an organisation has not been a revolution in the past, it's also the working class in Britain has not been revolutionary in the past. Is there not some correlation here? And one of the things I would say is that we lack a historical imagination on the left, particularly today. We've forgotten about what left-wing movements and radicalised periods look like. We've been so long in this situation. If, as I believe is happening now, and we're seeing the beginnings of it, we see a big swing towards the left. It will affect all layers of society, all intellectuals and all sorts of people, and all kind of people who were, the trajectories we go to the right will start to go to the left. I mean, even Blair was on the left when he first began. It's weird to believe that. And it's, well, no, actually I've gone into it a bit.
It's his lie, not yours.
No. But actually I've gone into it, and he doesn't want to go into how much it was, but he was on the left. I mean, not generally. Yeah, because that was, that's the point. It was the dominant fashion, it was the dominant feeling among people. Now, if that happens, can you imagine a situation in the future where the working class, forget the Labour Party trading, the working class is radicalised? Do we somehow think that the Labour Party is not going to be touched by that? The Labour Party is a totally opportunist beast, and it responds to the moods of the workers. And it's not you have to look at dialectics. It's not just a block. Factions come up in the Labour Party, movements come up, people come up to voice antagonisms. I mean, even this latest thing, especially with the social media that's happening now. One MP complained in this recent News International thing. He got 1,000 emails a day he was getting. Unbelievable, isn't that? And a deluge of public opinion. So that created a huge mood in the Parliament that they had to get their own back on Murdoch at last. About a lot of radical things. One of the weird things, I watched that parliamentary debate. It was, if I had been away and off the planet for about 20 years and had come back and I watched the way the Labour Party speakers were speaking, it was like it was the 1980s again. It was weird. And the thing is that it's a question of having historical imagination. Now, in that situation, let's look at the situation today. And I think that we should be less cautious about these things. Because I said the whole pattern of the history of 100 years has shown that Labour moves to the left in opposition. And I don't see any reason why it shouldn't happen now. And it's not good enough to dismiss that 50,000 members joining in 6 months is a lot of fucking people. If the other thing that's been said, and this has been picked up by the socialist press, that they're all Liberal Democrats. There's actually been an analysis of it within the LSE, and like a third of them were ex-Liberal Democrats. But they were just not members of Liberal Democracy, they voted Liberal Democrat, because the Liberal Democrats were saying they were more left-wing than the Labour Party. So, but even so, then you look at the trend on Facebook, for instance. Facebook has gone up in the last 4 or 5 months. The number of Labour Party people on the Labour Party supporters Facebook has gone up from 80-something thousand to 110,000. It's not insignificant. And this is a huge audience that we should be intervening with. And one of the great things about social networking is it lets us to reach over the heads of the bureaucracy and reach people direct. So and there's something that we on the left, and the LRC in particular, need to take on board, because there's a lot of potential from that. Even the election at last year's party conference, I've never been through an experience like that in my life. It was weird. It was the most tense that election. They were going through each round, and everybody in the hall. It was just the atmosphere. It was so bad that when we came out of the hall, even the seasoned journalists from BBC ITV were like this. And the reason was because it was the first time that the Blair machine had been checked. That was the important point. The Blair machine was going for David Miliband, and they were defeated. And it was defeated with mainly the trade union support, a very significant development, and on the basis of Ed Miliband putting very sort of radical stuff in his election manifestos, because he gets in power, and as someone else made the point, the main pressure on him is from the Blairites, so he's responding to that. That's why I described him as centrist. The term, Ben's not here, is he? Sorry. The term centrism that's used in the Trotskyist movement and a lot, I have got to the point of giving up on that term because it is used by every group to accuse every other group of being centrist. It's an insult, you know. And who's to interpret whether someone is revolutionary or, you know, you get to the point where you say, does it really describe very much? Labour Party is very different from the trade unions. I'm sorry, I've heard this again and again, but when you get active in the trade unions and you do it for a long time, I don't find it like that. Having been active in the Labour Party and the trade unions, the same struggle, same issues, same reformists. You're dealing with reformism in society and how you fight it. So the trade union leadership, the bureaucracy, are the same people you're fighting in the Labour Party. To think that somehow you will, by not being the Labour Party, you will find some other different debate. It isn't. It's the same debate. Of course, there are different practical things, but, you know, that's been my experience anyway. On the LRC, someone described the LRC as being left reformist. I would argue that the LRC, the problem with the LRC is there's not enough left reformists in it, which is indicative of the fact that they haven't got the base in the party. It's too many of them are revolutionaries of one sort or another. They're all communists, ex-Trotskyists, whatever, in the LRC pretty well, with a few exceptions. It's true they don't have a programme. And I think that's the problem which I think the CPGB is moving towards. I think it's what is missing in the whole of the left, that they don't have a good socialist programme about how we could build a new society. And therefore they end up with very defensive positions, which are almost saying, wouldn't it be nice if we were back in the 1980s in terms of welfare state and so on. So that was in response to Lee. There were a lot of other, some other things. The militant in the Enabling Act. Unfortunately, this was Mike McNair made this point in his analysis in Weekly Worker. And unfortunately, again, unless you're in the Labour Party working alongside the militant comrades, you might have this impression, but that's complete distortion. The militant never argued it like that. The militant always argued, I can quote for you verbatim in every speech they made, they said, the bureaucrats of the Labour Party say that we couldn't achieve it through Parliament because of all the problems of Parliament, the lengthy legislation, time, so on. There's no excuse for that. It was put forward in 1934 by Strachey and the other people on the left of the party. Let's have an enabling act whereby Labour comes into power after having mobilised the proletariat and then puts an enabling act which allows them to introduce socialism. So for a purely parliamentary argument, there is no argument to say you couldn't do it. Thanks. They always followed it up by saying the failure of the Labour movement to mobilise and so on leads to the danger of the army, a coup, the police, and all the rest of it. We constantly went on about Chile. That example will happen in Britain if we're not careful. I'm sorry, I did it again and again, and all the militant comrades did. That wasn't the militants' problem. And the reason why the militant was thrown out of the Labour Party is because they were accused of being revolutionaries and totally against Parliament and wanted to throw. And there was a famous speech by Pat Wall about the rivers of blood and all that stuff. You know these things. I mean, sorry. So it's a distortion that militant had that fault. That wasn't their problem. In my view, there's many other problems they had, but it wasn't particularly that they were left reformists. You mentioned about the mood of the German workers after the First World War. I'm afraid the mood of the German workers, they're not as we sometimes think it, but they were very different from Britain. Why? Simply because, for no other reasons, they had suffered far worse than the British workers in the last period of the war. Starvation, mass starvation and so on. They had lost the war, whereas the British had won the war. That makes a difference in people's psychology. So when you lose the war, it means that the ruling class and all this thing is completely discredited. Just like in Russia, when the Tsar lost the war with the Russian-Japanese war, that started a huge discrediting of the Tsarist bureaucracy, the same in the Russian Revolution. So the fact they'd lost the war and they were starving made a huge difference. Plus many other factors, but there was a big difference between Germany and Britain. And we can see the fact that the communist movement was huge in Germany, was small in Britain. You can see the consciousness different. I mean, by the way, there was an election held straight after the First World War. Unlike in Germany, when the election was held in Germany, it was between the Social Democrats and the independent left-wing Social Democrats. In Britain, the Tories won the election straight after the First World War. So it gives you the khaki election. So it gives you a bit of an idea. United Front. Well, actually, the United Front, I'm sorry, this idea that the Comintern is all-knowing and all-powerful. The United Front came from an idea cobbled together by Paul Levy and Radek. They wrote it together. It's this open letter. And it was because they faced this problem that they had formed the Communist Party. Yeah, they'd gained quite a lot of support, but it still was not the majority of the workers. And then they said to themselves, oh shit, we've got to get the majority of the workers. How do we reach these social democratic workers who stayed loyal to the social democrats, which they did not expect? So when that happened, they had to say, well, how can we do it? And they came up with the idea of the United Front in Germany. And then the Comintern saw that and said, oh, that's a good tactic. That's a good way to approach it. And Lenin and Trotsky and so on pushed the United Front. So even this thing about unionising the army, you mentioned about unionising the army. I have to say I support unionising the army, and I don't think it's this thing that you'll get them to be, that the main function of the union in the army will be about voting for more bombs or more better weapons. I'm sorry, that's not the historical experience. Even the Prison Officers Association now, by the way, the leader of the prison officers is supporting the campaign of the Socialist Party. I mean, you know, it just shows you the potential of things that could happen. When the police went on strike and formed unions in 1919 and so on, it was a revolutionary period, and there was radical movements, a strike for wages and so on. So I think that if we think we can achieve a revolution without having organised the rank and file of the army and split them away from the officers, forget it. If they are still in a united organisation, they're going to mow us down. And that, if you look at the example of the Russian Revolution, I mean, admittedly different circumstances, they won when the regiments voted to transfer authority from the High Command to the Revolutionary Policy Committee of the Soviet. That was the revolution made. It was all over by the shouting once they'd done that. So it was a democratic movement among the soldiers to change their command. We should be arguing for these things, democratisation of the state and so on. So I'm sorry about that, but I think there's so many issues raised in there. Last point I come out on is, how do you overcome the threat of expulsion? There were some things about the SDF which, by the way, the SDF didn't split because of Tory money. That wasn't the reason, but I won't go to this. How do we overcome the threat of expulsion? Well, yes, one could dismiss it as trying to be clever or trying to be whatever. I would put it this way. We should make it as difficult as possible for the bureaucracy to kick us out of the movement. Now, the bureaucracy wants to kick us out of the movement. They'd like to get us rid of us in the trade unions, probably, and so on, etc. It's not because they are confident, but because they're weak politically. And they know that if we had a free and fair debate with equal access to all the means of communication, that over a period of time we'd win the argument. And that's always been my experience, actually. Even when the Clause 4, you know when they got rid of Clause 4, Blair pushed for this getting rid of Clause 4, we set up the Defend Clause 4 campaign, which I was on the National Committee on. And we had debates all over the country with Labour Party members. And in every single one of them, except for one, and I think it was like about 55 meetings, where we had a vote at the end of it, only one did we lose. We won all of them. Because our arguments are strong. So they want to try and restrict us from having an even playing field of debate in the movement. And we know that. And the more stronger we get, the more they want to do that. The question we then have to think is, do we just blunder about and do all the faults fall straight into their hands and make their life easy for them to throw us out by just the way we've behaved in the past? Or do we think carefully? And this is a question I come back to. We have never really studied, and you'll notice there's virtually no serious books about what happened in the 70s and the 80s in the Labour Party. And most of the stuff I'm doing research on, there's hardly anything written about. I'm having to go to all sorts of sources because the left has not studied social democracy, they've not studied reformism, how consciousness affects people, how they relate to their leaders, and what motivates them, what puts them off, what they can respond to. So as a result, we just blunder in there, and we make it very easy for them to expel us. So yes, there will be this pressure for them to try and push us out, but they don't control everything. There's all sorts of things going on, and there's pressures and things they can get away with, things they can't justify to the rank and file, and we have to learn those things and try as much as we can. Putting forward our politics, of course, don't need to hide your politics, it's all about how you then present them. That's very important, and tactically operate to make it difficult to be expelled. And this is something, a big debate that we need to think about, and it's something we'll face the comrades in Labour Party Marxists, for example, I think. Thanks.
Thank you.